I grew up in the hollers of eastern Kentucky, the kind of place where the mountains press in so tight you forget what an open sky looks like, where the creeks run black with coal dust and old secrets, and where people don't talk about the things they've seen in the woods because talking about them makes them real. I spent 12 years working for the Forest Service, marking timber, clearing deadfall, maintaining trails that hadn't seen a hiker in decades. I thought I'd seen everything those mountains had to offer. I was wrong, dead wrong. The summer of 2019 had been a wet one, the kind of season where the humidity hangs off you like a second skin and the mosquitoes come in, clouds thick enough to block the sun. By August, I was itching for something different, something that would remind me why I'd fallen in love with the backcountry in the first place. That's when my buddy Derek called. He'd been my partner on more trail crews than I could count. A weary man from Pike County with hands like bear paws and a laugh that could carry across a valley. He'd rounded up to other guys from our old crew Cal, a quiet former Marine who never talked about his service, and JT, a big-hearted kid from Whitesburg who'd only been with us a couple seasons but had proven himself steady in the crisis. Derek had a plan. He wanted to hike the Black Hollow Ridge Trail now. The Black Hollow Ridge wasn't on any official map anymore. The Forest Service had stopped maintaining it back in the 90s after a series of budget cuts, and the trail had been swallowed by undergrowth, fallen trees, and time itself. But old-timers still talked about it. They said it followed the spine of the ridge for 12 miles, cutting through some of the most remote country in the Appalachians, country that hadn't seen a chainsaw or a surveyor in half a century. Derek had found an old topo map in his grandfather's attic, the paper yellowed and brittle, the contour lines faded but still legible. He was convinced we could do it in 3 days, so if we pushed hard, I should have said no. I knew better, but there was something about that summer, something restless and hungry in the air, and I found myself agreeing before I'd really thought it through. We met at the trailhead on a Friday morning in late August, the kind of day where the heat already feels oppressive before the sun has fully cleared the ridgeline. The official trailhead was little more than a gravel pull-off on a Forest Service road. The wooden signpost rotted and collapsed into the weeds. There was no parking area, no information. Board, no indication that anyone had stood in that spot in years. We shouldered our packs 40 pounds each, loaded with enough food and gear for days just to be safe, and stepped into the trees. The first few miles were brutal. The trail, where it existed at all, was a narrow depression in the leaf. Litter, barely wide enough for one person, rhododendron and mountain laurel closed in on both sides, their branches snagging our packs and scratching our arms. Fallen logs blocked the path every 100 yards or so, forcing us to climb over or crawl under, our muscles burning in the humid air. By midday, we were all soaked with sweat, our shirts plastered to our backs, our water consumption already higher than we planned. But the forest was beautiful in its own wild, untamed way. Old growth hemlocks towered overhead, their trunks so massive that 3 men couldn't have linked arms around them. Ferns grew in dense carpets on the forest floor, their fronds brushing our knees as we passed. Every so often, we'd catch a glimpse of the valley below through a break in the canopy, the haze of summer heat rising off the treetops like steam. We made camp that first night in a small hollow about 6 miles in, a flat spot between two massive boulders where a spring seeped from the rock face. The water was cold and sweet, better than anything that came from a tap. We built a small fire more for comfort than necessity, since the temperature hadn't dropped much with the sun, and sat around it eating dehydrated chili and talking about nothing in particular. Derek told stories about his grandfather, a coal miner who worked the deep seams below these mountains until black lung took him at 56. Cal sat quietly, methodically cleaning his boots, his face unreadable in the firelight. JT was full of energy, excited to be out in the real backcountry for the first time, asking questions about every bird call and rustle in the undergrowth. I remember watching him, thinking how young he seemed, how innocent. I wanted to warn him about something, but I didn't know what. The second day was harder. The trail climbed steeply, switched backing up the face of the ridge, and the undergrowth grew thicker, more hostile. Thorny vines grabbed at our legs, and the humidity seemed to increase with every foot of elevation. By afternoon, we were moving through a cloud, the mist so thick that I could barely see Derek 10 feet ahead of me. The world shrank to a gray bubble, the only sounds our ragged breathing and the drip of water from the leaves. We navigated by compass and dead reckoning, checking the old topo map at every switchback, trying to match the faded contour lines to the terrain we could barely see. We should have reached the ridge crest by 4 o'clock, but the mist had slowed us to a crawl, and it was nearly 7 before we stumbled onto a narrow saddle, the ground leveling out for the first time in hours. We were exhausted, our legs shaking, our clothes soaked through with sweat and condensation. Derek called a halt, and we dropped our packs in a small clearing. Too tired to look for a better campsite, I remember thinking that the clearing felt wrong, too regular, too flat, as if someone had deliberately leveled it. But I was too tired to care. We ate cold trail mix for dinner, too exhausted to bother with the stove, and crawled into our sleeping bags as the last gray light faded from the mist. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The mist had cleared while we slept, and the sky above was impossibly clear. The stars so bright and numerous that they seemed to press down on us, heavy with their own weight. The moon hadn't risen yet, and the darkness between the trees was absolute, a blackness so complete it felt like a physical presence. I lay there for a moment, trying to remember what had pulled me from sleep, my heart hammering against my ribs for reasons I couldn't name. Then I saw it that at first I thought it was a star, low on the horizon, caught in the branches of a distant tree. But stars don't move, and this light was moving, bobbing gently up and down in a rhythm that reminded me of someone walking. I sat up slowly, my sleeping bag rustling loudly in the silence, and stared. The light was about 200 yards upslope from our camp, maybe less, hanging at about chest height among the hemlocks. It wasn't a headlamp. I'd seen thousands of headlamps in my years in the woods, and this was different. The glow was too warm, too steady, the color of old amber or candle flame, not the harsh white or blue of modern lads. It moved with a deliberation that spoke of intention, pausing at intervals, then continuing on a path that seemed to parallel the ridge line. "Derek," I whispered, my voice sounding strange and small in the vast darkness. "Derek, wake up." He stirred, grumbling, and I reached over and shook his shoulder harder. "Get up, look." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and followed my pointing finger. The light had paused again, hanging motionless in the trees, and for a moment I thought it might wink out, disappear like a dream upon waking. But it didn't. It hung there, steady and patient, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach, a premonition of dread that I couldn't explain and couldn't shake. "What is that?" JT asked, his voice high and thin. He and Cal were both awake now, all 4 of us sitting in our sleeping bags, staring up at the light like men transfixed. "Maybe another hiker," Cal suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. There were no other trails up here, no other access points for miles, and no hiker carried a light like that. "Could be a hunting camp," Derek said, but he was reaching for his boots, pulling them on with the automatic movements of a man who didn't believe his own words. Maybe someone got lost, separated from their group. The light began to move again, drifting slowly to the left, following the contour of the ridge. And then it paused once more, and in that pause, I felt something that I can only describe as an invitation. The light seemed to pulse, a gentle brightening and dimming that matched the rhythm of a heartbeat. And I knew with a certainty that bypassed logic and reason that it wanted us to follow. "We should check it out," Derek said, standing and reaching for his pack. "If someone's lost up here, they could be in real trouble. Weather's supposed to turn tomorrow." "Derek," I said, and my voice came out rough, almost a growl. "We don't know what that is. We don't know who's out here. The GPS is dead. We have no signal, and we're 12 miles from the nearest road. This is not a good idea." He looked at me, and in the starlight, I could see the conflict on his face. Derek was a good man, a responsible man. He'd spent his life helping people, clearing trails, fighting fires, pulling stranded hikers off mountainsides. The thought of someone lost and suffering in the dark was more than he could bear. But he was also mountain-born, raised on stories of things that lived in the hollers, things that wore the shapes of men but weren't men at all. I saw those stories warring in his eyes, the modern ranger against the superstitious child. "We'll just get closer," he said finally. "See if we can. Make contact. If it feels wrong, we come straight back." I wanted to argue more, to grab his arm and pull him down, to tell him that I'd fell. I had heard about Devil's Elbow my whole life. The way you hear about places that exist in the spaces between what people are willing to say out loud and what they only whisper after too many beers. On the porch at midnight, my grandmother called it the Hungry Mountain, though that name never appeared on any map, and my grandfather, a man who spent 40 years logging the Monongahela National Forest, would cross himself whenever it came up in conversation, a gesture so automatic I don't think he even knew he was doing it. By the time I enrolled at Alderson Broadus in the fall of 2015, I had filed Devil's Elbow away with all the other Appalachian ghost stories, the kind of thing that made for good campfire talk, but had no real purchase on the actual world of classes and part-time jobs and the slow, grinding business of becoming an adult. I was wrong about that, too. I was wrong about so many things. The four of us had been friends since freshman orientation, thrown together by the random machinery of dorm assignments, and kept together by the particular loneliness of being young and far from home in a place where the mountains pressed against the windows, and the winters lasted 8 months. There was me, Lena, studying forestry with the vague idea that I might work for the Park Service someday, might escape the hollows and ridges that had shaped every generation of my family. There was Derek, a philosophy major from Charleston who talked incessantly about Kant and Heidegger and the phenomenology of fear, as if naming something could tame it. There was Marisol, a biology student from Morgantown with a practical streak, a mile wide and a laugh that could fill a room. And there was Tommy, who wasn't really a student anymore, who had dropped out after sophomore year to work construction in Elkins, but still hung around campus, still showed up at our apartments, still carried himself with the restless energy of someone who couldn't quite figure out where he belonged. That it was Tommy who suggested the hike. Late on a Thursday night in October, all of us crammed into Derek's battered Subaru, driving back from a concert in Lewisburg with the heater blasting against the chill that had settled into the valley. Tommy had been drinking, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different about his mood that night, a manic edge that made the rest of us exchange glances in the darkness. He talked about Devil's Elbow the way he talked about everything when he was like this, fast and intense and slightly desperate, as if the words were building a wall against something he couldn't name. Missing persons cases, he said, leaning forward from the back seat, his breath warm and beery against my neck. going back to the 50s. Hikers, hunters, kids who wandered off. They find some of them eventually, up in the rocks, frozen solid, no sign of what happened. Others they never find at all. My uncle was on a search party in '89, looking for some woman who got separated from her group. He said the fog came in so fast you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and when it cleared, half the searchers were gone, just gone. They found them 3 days later, wandering in circles. Couldn't remember their own names. That's bullshit, Marisol said, but her voice lacked conviction. We all knew the stories. Everyone who grew up within 50 miles of those mountains knew the stories. Let's go, Tommy said. This weekend, weather's supposed to be clear. Weekend, summit, be back before dark. Prove it's just a mountain. I should have said no. I knew the mountain, knew its reputation, knew the way the weather could turn in minutes at that elevation, the way the fog could roll in from nowhere and swallow everything. But there was something in Tommy's voice, something raw and hungry, and I recognized it because I felt it too. That restless need to test yourself against something bigger than your own small fears, to stand on the edge of the unknown and prove that you weren't afraid. So I said yes, and Derek said yes, and Marisol rolled her eyes, but agreed to come. And by the time we dropped Tommy at his apartment, the plan was set. We left campus before dawn on Saturday. Derek's Subaru loaded with gear we didn't really know how to use. Packed stuff with energy bars and instant coffee and the cheap synthetic sleeping bags we'd bought at Walmart. The drive took 2 hours, winding through valleys where the mist pooled in the low places and the first hints of autumn color touched the ridges. We turned onto Forest Service Road 112, a gravel track that climbed steeply through Second Grove. Hardwood, the branches closing overhead until we were driving through a tunnel of yellow and gold. The trailhead was unmarked, just a pull-off where the road crested a ridge. The surrounding forest dense and silent that we started up at 8, the air sharp and clean, our breath visible in the morning cold. The trail was steep but well-defined, switchbacking through stands of birch and maple, the leaves crunching under our boots. Tommy led, setting a pace that was too fast, driven by that same manic energy from Thursday night. And the rest of us followed, spread out in a loose line, talking when the trail allowed, silent when it grew too steep for breath. By noon, we'd gained 2,000 feet, and the forest had changed. The deciduous trees giving way to spruce and fir, the air thinner, the sky closer. We stopped for lunch on a rocky outcrop with a view of the valley below, the patchwork of farms, and forest stretching to the horizon, the mountains beyond layered blue and purple in the distance. We should turn back, Marisol said, squinting at her phone. Weather apps showing in front moving in this afternoon. Apps are wrong half the time. Tommy said, already shouldering his pack. We're almost to the tree line. Another hour to the summit. Our back down. We'll beat anything. He was already moving, and we followed. Because that's what you do when you're young and stupid and convinced of your own invincibility. The trail grew steeper, rockier, the trees shorter and more twisted until we broke out of the forest entirely and found ourselves on the slope of broken shale, the peak of Devil's Elbow visible above us, a jagged tooth against the sky. The wind hit us then, a cold blast that cut through our jackets like they were made of paper, and I felt the first stirrings of real concern, the animal part of my brain registering that we were exposed, vulnerable, that the mountain had allowed us this far but could change its mind at any moment. We were maybe 500 feet from the summit when the fog came that it didn't roll in, the way fog usually does, creeping up the valleys, softening the edges of things. It simply appeared as if someone had drawn a curtain across the world. One moment clear air and distant views, the next a gray wall so thick I couldn't see Derek. Walking 10 feet ahead of me, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds, the wind dying to nothing, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I stopped, disoriented, my sense of balance suddenly unreliable, the ground beneath my feet seeming to tilt in directions that didn't exist. "Derek," I shouted, and my voice was swallowed by the fog, deadened, returned to me flat and strange. "Here." His voice came from somewhere to my left, too close, wrong somehow. Everyone stopped moving. "Stay where you are." We found each other by sound, groping through the gray, our hands outstretched like blind people. When we were together, huddled in a tight cluster, I could see their faces only as pale blurs, features smeared and indistinct. The cold was intense now, seeping through my clothes, through my skin, into my bones. I could feel my body beginning to shut down, the first stages of hypothermia. My thoughts growing sluggish, my hands starting to shake. "We need shelter," Marisol said, her teeth chattering. "Now, before we can't move." Tommy wanted to push for the summit, still driven by that manic energy, but even he could feel the cold now, could see the danger in the gray world that had swallowed us. We descended blindly, feeling our way down the slope, sliding on loose rock, catching ourselves on outcrops that appeared from nowhere. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we found the rock overhang, a shallow cave formed by a massive boulder that had split from the cliff above, creating a space just large enough for the four of us to squeeze into. It wasn't much protection, but it blocked the wind, and we huddled together, sharing body heat, our packs piled around us as a pathetic barrier against the cold. I don't know how long we sat there. Time lost meaning in that gray void, compressed and stretched by the cold and the silence. We ate energy bars without tasting them, sipped water that had begun to freeze in our bottles, talked in low voices about nothing, anything to maintain the illusion that we were still in control, still capable of decision and action. But I could see it in their faces, the same fear I felt, the dawning realization that we were in real trouble, that the mountain had us, that our phones showed no signal, our GPS couldn't find satellites, our compasses spun uselessly in hands that shook with cold. That it was Tommy who saw it first. He had been staring out into the fog, his face slack, his eyes unfocused, and suddenly he stiffened, pointing with a hand that trembled. "Look," he whispered, "down there, in the valley." We looked. At first, I saw nothing but gray, the uniform opacity of the fog. Then, gradually, a light began to resolve itself, faint at first, then stronger. A flickering orange glow that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. It was below us, far below. In the valley we crossed hours earlier, and it was too large for a campfire, too controlled for a wildfire, burning in a perfect circle that held its shape against the wind that wasn't blowing. I came back from my third deployment in pieces, though the VA doctors couldn't find anything wrong with the x-rays, or the blood work or the scans. That mapped inside of my skull. I walked onto legs, spoke in complete sentences, held down. A job at the lumberyard in Galax for nearly 2 years before the panic attacks got so bad. I couldn't stand in an open room without feeling the walls pressing. The Marines gave me a discharge and a medal and a prescription for pills. That made everything feel wrapped in cotton, distant and muffled, like I was listening to my own life through a closed door. By the spring of 2015, I was living in a trailer on my cousin's property outside Independence, sleeping 14 hours a day, waking to the sound of my own screaming more often than not. That's when I got the call from Webb. Webb had been my squad leader in Helmand, a quiet man from Buchanan County with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. Souvenir from an IED that hadn't quite killed him. He'd gotten out 2 years before me, had spent the interim working construction in Roanoke, drinking too much, driving his truck to the Blue Ridge Parkway in the middle of the night to sit on the overlooks and stare at the darkness between the mountains. He said he was organizing a trip, something to get the old crew back together. For of us who'd made it through that last rotation more or less intact, Morrison, our corpsman, had finished his residency and was working emergency medicine in Bristol, pulling double shifts and sleeping in the on-call room because the apartment felt too big, too empty, too full of noises that weren't there. Vance, our radio operator, had moved back to his family's farm in Grayson County, was living in the basement of his parents' house at 32, helping his father with the cattle, going whole days without speaking to another human being. Webb's plan was simple: the Cranberry Bog Wilderness, a protected area in the Jefferson National Forest that straddled the Virginia-West Virginia line. 20,000 acres of high-elevation bog and spruce forest that most people had never heard of, and fewer still ever visited. It was supposed to be a day hike, in and out, nothing strenuous, just for men walking through country that hadn't changed in 10,000 years, breathing air that didn't smell like diesel and dust and cordate, reminding ourselves that we were still alive, still capable of movement and decision and the simple animal pleasure of putting one foot in front of the other. I agreed because Webb asked, because I owed him for the times he dragged me out of burning vehicles and screaming crowds, because some part of me, buried deep beneath the pills and the nightmares and the constant low-grade hum of anxiety, still remembered what it felt like to want something. We met at the trailhead on a Saturday morning in late June, the air already warm and thick with the promise of summer storms. Webb drove up in his battered F-150, Morrison in a Subaru that smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee, Vance on a motorcycle that he'd rebuilt himself during the long winter months on the farm. We shook hands, embraced awkwardly, stood around the parking area making small talk that skirted the edges of everything we weren't saying. We looked at each other with the careful appraisal of men who had seen each other at their worst and weren't sure what remained beneath the damage. The trail was well maintained for the first 2 miles, a gravel path that wound through Second Grove, hardwood, crossing streams on wooden bridges, passing through meadows where wildflowers grew in dense profusion. We walked in a loose group, Webb leading, the rest of us spread out behind, our silence comfortable in a way that only comes from shared experience, from the knowledge that no explanation is necessary because no explanation would be sufficient. Morrison talked about the overdoses and car wrecks and domestic disputes that filled his nights, his voice fat and clinical, the voice of a man who had learned to describe horror without feeling it. Vance said almost nothing, just nodded at appropriate intervals, his eyes scanning the trees with the same methodical sweep he'd used to check for snipers on rooftops in Kandahar. The bridge was supposed to be at mile 3, a wooden span across, the Cranberry River that marked the boundary between the maintained trail and the wilderness area beyond. We found it collapsed, the timbers rotted through, the whole structure tumbled into the water below. A tangle of gray wood and rusted nails. Webb studied it for a long moment, hands on his hips, then pulled out his map, a USGS topo that showed the area in detail, contour lines and elevation marks, and the thin dashed line of the trail continuing on the far side. "We can ford it," he said. "Water doesn't look deep." It was deeper than it looked. We waded in, the current tugging at our legs, the water cold even in the June heat, rising to our knees, then our thighs, then our waists. The riverbed was slick with algae, and Morrison slipped, went under, came up sputtering and cursing, his pack soaked through. We helped him to the far bank, where we sat on rocks and wrung out our clothes and assessed the damage. His sleeping bag was ruined, his food compromised, his phone dead from the water. But he was laughing, actually laughing, a sound I hadn't heard from him in years. And something in me loosened, some knot of tension I hadn't known I was carrying. "We'll make it a shorter loop," Webb said, studying the map. "Cut across here. Follow this drainage back to the main trail. Should still get us out by dark." The unmarked path he found was little more than a game trail, a narrow depression in the undergrowth that wound through stands of rhododendron and mountain laurel, the branches closing overhead until we were walking through a green tunnel. The light dim and filtered. The ground grew softer, spongier, until we were slogging through muck that sucked at our boots. The water seeping in around the laces, cold and black and smelling of decay. The trail, such as it was, deteriorated further until we were wading through waist-deep water, the bog proper, a landscape of stunted trees and floating vegetation and pools of dark water that reflected the sky in fragments that we should have turned back. Every instinct I had, every lesson learned in deserts and mountains and urban ruins, screamed at me to stop, to retrace our steps, to get out of that water and that muck and that green, suffocating light. But Webb kept moving, and Morrison was, still riding the high of his unexpected laughter, and Vance followed without comment. And I followed them because that was what I did, what I had always done, what the Marines had trained into me until it was deeper than thought, deeper than fear. By late afternoon, the sky had lowered, clouds building in the west, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. We were lost, though no one said the word, moving through a landscape that repeated itself endlessly. The same stunted trees, the same black water, the same floating mats of sphagnum moss that shifted and sank beneath our feet. Webb checked his compass, frowned, checked it again, held it flat in his palm, and watched the needle swing in slow circles, never settling, never finding north. The map was useless here, the topo lines not matching any terrain we could see, the trail we had followed, simply disappearing into the muck. "We need to find high ground," Morrison said, his clinical voice returning, the laughter gone as if it had never been. "Set up camp, wait for the weather to clear. Try again in the morning." But there was no high ground, only the endless flat expanse of the bog, the water stretching in all directions, the stunted trees rising from it like the fingers of drowning men. We pressed on, because stopping felt like surrender, felt like admitting that the wilderness had beaten us, that we were no longer the men who had survived Helmand and Kandahar, and all the other places that had tried to kill us. The light faded, gradually, the green tunnel dimming to gray, then to black, until we were moving by feel alone, our hands outstretched, our feet probing the muck for solid ground that never came. It was Vance who saw it first. He stopped so suddenly that I walked into his back, felt the solidity of him, the tension in his muscles. He was staring out across the water, his face pale in the gathering darkness, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "Light," he whispered. "Over there." I looked. At first, I saw nothing but the darkness, the uniform black of the bog at night, broken only by the faint reflection of cloud-covered stars on the still water. Then, gradually, a light began to resolve itself, pale and blue, hovering just above the water's surface on the far side of the bog. It was faint at first, no brighter than a distant star, but it grew stronger as we watched, coalescing into a distinct point of illumination, the color of a gas flame, of deep ice, of something that had no name in the natural world. That we knew the stories. Every Appalachian child knows the stories, has heard them from grandparents and cousins and the old men who sit on the porches of country stores, swapping tales with the solemnity of historians recounting verified fact. Willow, the wisp, they call it, or jackal, lantern, or corpse candle, swamp gas, The scientists say methane ignited by spontaneous combustion, a chemical reaction with no consciousness, no purpose, no malice. But standing in that bog, watching that blue light hover and pulse, I knew with a certainty that bypassed reason that this was not swamp gas, not chemistry, not anything that could be explained by the textbooks and the rational world I had tried so hard to believe in.